e4. King's pawn opening, opening line. The king's pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the queen and the bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. e5. King's pawn game, opening line. Black responds symmetrically, making a direct challenge to the central squares. Knight f3. King's knight opening, opening line. With the possible exception of 2f4, this is the most logical second move against black's symmetrical answer to the king pawn. The knight attacks e5, clears the way for an eventual castle, and rests on its best defensive square. Knight c6. Queen's knight variation, opening line. Now, when white plays 3 knight c3 instead of the Ruy Lopez, it's the three knights game, a leisurely system. Bishop b5. Ruy Lopez Spanish, opening line. This is the Ruy Lopez move. It is designed to maintain long-term pressure on black's center. If driven away, the king's bishop will take up a position at b3 or c2 to focus on a kingside attack or on the central squares. Knight f6. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, opening line. The Berlin defense was common at the turn of the century at the highest levels of play. The intent is to take advantage of the exposed position of the white bishop in some variations, but it usually leads to cramped positions in which white has more options. Castle kingside. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, opening line. Knight takes e4. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. d4. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Knight d6. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Too greedy is 5 e takes d4, 6 rook e1 when white is on top. Bishop takes c6. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. d takes c6. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. d takes e5. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Knight f5. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Queen takes d8, check. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. King takes d8. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Knight c3. Out of opening book. Rook d1, check. Would have been in the Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, book opening. h6. h3. Bishop d7. b3. King c8. Bishop b2. b6. Rook a d1. c5. Knight d5. a5. c4. a4. Rook d2. Bishop e6. Blocks white's pawn at e5. Rook f d1. g5. Knight h2. King b7. Knight g4. blocks black's pawn at g5. A takes b3, attacks white's pawn at a2 with 2 pieces, and isolates white's pawn at c4 and white's pawn at a2. A takes b3. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. h5 threatens white's knight at g4. Knight g f6 moves it to safety and blocks black's pawn at f7. Bishop h6. Knight takes h5. g4 attacks white's rook at d2. H takes g4, threatens black's knight and isolates black's pawn at f7. Bishop takes d2. G takes f5, attacks black's bishop at e6. Bishop takes d5. C takes d5. Rook takes h5, attacks white's pawn at f5. Rook takes d2. Rook takes f5. Black wins a rook, 2 knights, and a pawn for 2 bishops, a knight, and 2 pawns. f3. Rook e8. King f2. Rook f takes e5. Slightly better is rook h5. Diagnosing. The chess master recommends rook to h5. You move your rook to h5. White responds by moving rook to e2. You move your rook to d8, which attacks white's pawn at d5. White responds by moving pawn to e6, which attacks your pawn at f7. Your rook at h5 takes pawn. White counters with bishop to f6, which attacks your rook at d8 and blocks your pawn at f7. You move your rook to g8, which moves it to safety. White counters with pawn, captures pawn, which attacks your rook at g8, adds a promote threat at f7, and creates passed pawns on f7, f3, and g2. You move your rook to f8, which moves it to safety, threatens white's pawn at f7, blocks white's pawn at f7, and removes the promote threat at f7. White responds by moving the pawn to g4, which pushes the passed pawn. Your rook captures pawn, which attacks white's bishop. White counters with rook to e6, which protects white's bishop. You move your king to c8. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win 2 pawns for a pawn. Additionally, your attack potential is increased. Also, your pawn development is a little stronger, and the development of white's pawns is disrupted. Rook f takes e5. Slightly better is rook h5. Bishop takes e5. Rook takes e5. White wins a rook for a bishop and a pawn. Material is even. f4. Attacks black's rook. Rook e4. Moves it to safety and threatens white's pawn at f4. King f3. removes the threat on white's pawn at f4 and threatens black's rook. Rook b4 moves it to safety, attacks white's pawn at b3 and blocks white's pawn at b3. Rook d3 protects white's pawn at b3. King c8. King g4. King d7. King f5 frees white's pawn at f4 from the pin. King d6 blocks white's pawn at d5. g4. Rook d4 forks white's pawn at d5 and white's rook. Rook takes d4 protects white's pawn at d5. C takes d4 attacks white's pawn at d5 and creates a passed pawn on d4. Black wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. King e4 removes the threat on white's pawn at d5 and attacks black's pawn at d4. d3 pushes the passed pawn. King takes d3. King takes d5. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. g5. c5. f5. b5. g6 attacks black's pawn at f7. F takes g6 attacks white's pawn at f5 and isolates white's pawn at f5. F takes g6 creates a passed pawn on g6. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. King e6. King e4. c4 threatens white's pawn at b3. B takes c4 threatens black's pawn at b5 and isolates black's pawn at b5. B takes c4 creates a passed pawn on c4. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. King d4 attacks black's pawn. King f6 attacks white's pawn. King takes c4. King takes g6. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. The game ends in a draw.